She was standing at the bottom of her own staircase when her mother-in-law reached out and took the necklace from around her neck. Not asked for it, not requested it, took it. Right there in front of 12 guests, 3 household staff members, and a sister-in-law who was already smiling before My-suk's fingers had even finished with the clasp. Something belonging to this family, Mi-suk said, her voice smooth and quiet the way a blade is quiet, should be worn by someone who belongs to this family. Amara didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't move. She stood there in the dress she'd spent an hour choosing, in the home she had every legal right to call hers, and she felt the weight of that necklace leave her skin, like something being erased. If that were you standing in your own home, surrounded by your husband's family, holding your dignity together with both hands, while they stripped something precious from your body, what would you do? If you've ever felt like an outsider in a place you were supposed to belong, this story is going to stay with you. Subscribe right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens when that front door opens will change everything. Hit like, drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning Amara flew out of Chicago, the temperature was 11 degrees and her mother wouldn't stop crying. That was the part nobody showed in the wedding. Photographs, not the ceremony in Seoul, not the receptions that filled 3 floors of a private venue, Amara still couldn't believe existed in real life. None of those pictures captured her mother, Dorothy Bennett, standing at the departure gate in O'Hare with a tissue pressed so hard against her mouth, it left a red mark on her lip. "You don't have to go," Dorothy said. She said it the way mothers say things they already know the answer to. Not really asking, just needing to say it out loud one more time before the gate closed. "Mama." Amara squeezed her hands. "I'm not going to war. I'm going to my husband. Korea. Korea. You don't speak Korean." "I'm learning." Dorothy looked at her daughter for a long moment, this tall, careful woman she'd raised to be steady in rooms that didn't want her, and she shook her head slowly. Not in disapproval, more like someone trying to memorize a face before a long absence. "He better be worth it," she finally said. Amara thought about Tae-jin, the way he'd looked at her the first time they met, at a trade conference in Chicago she'd attended as an interpreter. The way he sat across from her at dinner 3 weeks later, and told her in perfectly measured English that he had been thinking about the way she laughed since the moment he heard it. The way he held her hand in the car after their 3rd date, like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. "He is," she said. She believed it. She still believes it now. That part matters. Kwon Tae-jin had not gotten to where he was by being soft. That was the first thing Amara learned about him, not from him directly, but from the way rooms changed when he walked into them. How conversations quieted, how people who had been laughing a second before suddenly found reasons to straighten their jackets and stand up a little taller. He was 35 years old, and he ran the Kwon organization the way his father had, and his grandfather before that, with patience, precision, and a kind of controlled authority that didn't need to raise its voice to make itself understood. In Seoul's underworld, his name meant something specific. It meant, "Do not test this." But with Amara, he was different. She'd noticed it before she fully understood what she was noticing. The way his shoulders dropped slightly when it was just the two of them. How he'd make coffee in the morning with his sleeves pushed up and his hair not quite combed and looked so ordinary it startled her. How he once spent 45 minutes on the phone helping her mother troubleshoot a printer issue, in English, patiently, because Amara had mentioned offhand that Dorothy was stressed about a document she needed to print for a doctor's appointment. He didn't tell Amara he'd done it. Dorothy mentioned it during their next call, almost confused. "That husband of yours called me back, fixed the whole thing. Wouldn't let me thank him. That was Tae-jin, not the version the world knew. The other one, the one who saved the last piece of whatever they were eating and pushed it toward her plate without saying anything. The one who kept a lamp on in the study because she'd told him once, 7 months before they got married, that she didn't like sleeping in complete darkness. He remembered everything she told him. That was either the most loving thing about him or the most dangerous, and Amara had decided early on that, in his case, it was the former. The Kwon estate sat in a part of Seoul that didn't advertise itself. No flashy gates, no obvious display of wealth from the street. Just walls and length and the quiet certainty of a place that had been built to last by people who didn't need anyone else's opinion of it. Amara's first real look at it was in the evening, and her first thought was that it looked like something out of a period drama, the kind of house that came with its own history, its own rules, its own gravitational pull. Her second thought was, I am going to have to learn how to belong here. She was good at learning. She'd spent her whole career being good at learning, studying languages, reading rooms, finding the tone that worked in any given situation. She had a practical streak that her mother called her Chicago bones, the ability to look at a difficult thing without flinching and start figuring out the logistics. So she'd studied Korean language classes every morning before Tae-jin woke up, books on formal etiquette, long conversations with a Korean American colleague from Chicago who had married into a traditional family and gave her a thorough, honest, slightly terrifying rundown of what to expect. The mother is the one you need to win, her colleague had told her. Not the husband. You already have him. It's the mother. Amara had taken that seriously. She'd prepared a small, carefully chosen gift for Kwon Mi-suk. A silk scarf from a Chicago boutique, not flashy, but quality you could feel with your hands. She'd practiced a formal greeting in Korean until she could deliver it without hesitating. She'd dressed conservatively on the day of the introduction, chosen a style she thought conveyed respect. Mi-suk had accepted the scarf with both hands and a polite nod and said something in Korean that Tae-jin translated with a carefully neutral expression as, how thoughtful. That was it. No warmth, no curiosity, no opening. Just two Korean words that closed a door as politely as a door had ever been closed. Amara had smiled and moved on. Sometimes people took time. She understood that. She was a stranger in their home, from a different country, a different culture, and she had just married their son and brother without a courtship the family had supervised or a proposal they had arranged. She could be patient. She was good at patience. What she hadn't prepared for was how patience could be used against you. The first time it happened, she told herself it was a misunderstanding. It was the third week. A family dinner. Tae-jin was there, at the head of the table, and Amara sat beside him. When the meal was being served, she noticed that her portion was different from everyone else's. Smaller, plated differently, set down without the dishes that appeared on the other plates. She didn't say anything. Maybe it was an error. Maybe the kitchen was still learning her preferences. Tae-jin was in the middle of a conversation with his uncle and didn't notice. The second time, she was almost certain it wasn't accidental. Tae-jin had been called away on business 3 days in Busan, and a gathering of women from the family's social circle had come to the estate for tea. Amara came downstairs dressed and ready to join them, and Mi-suk had looked at her, then turned back to her guests, and simply continued the conversation as though Amara hadn't appeared. One of the guests glanced at Amara and then quickly looked away in the particular manner of someone who has just witnessed an awkwardness they have decided not to acknowledge. Amara stood there for 4 full seconds, she counted, without meaning to, and then she said, in Korean, "Good afternoon," turned, and went back upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the room she shared with her husband and looked at the wall for a while. She didn't call her mother. She didn't call Tae-jin. She went to the window and watched the garden below, where one of the groundskeepers was trimming the hedges with quiet, methodical focus, and she made herself breathe slowly until the burning behind her eyes went away. The thing about Seo Yeon was that she was intelligent. Amara recognized that early, and it made everything worse. Cruelty from an intelligent person has an architecture to it. It knows exactly where to place its weight. Kwon Seo Yeon was 26, 3 years younger than Amara, and she had grown up being the treasured daughter of a powerful family in a city that rewarded power. She was quick-witted and pretty, and had friends who laughed at everything she said, and she had clearly never spent a single day of her life being made to feel like she didn't belong somewhere. She didn't call Amara names. She wasn't stupid enough for that. She simply excluded her with perfect, deniable precision. When family photos were taken, Seo Yeon would position herself in the grouping in a way that left Amara on the edge, or not in the frame at all. If Amara made a comment during a conversation, Seo Yeon would let a small pause pass before responding to whoever was standing next to Amara, as though the words had come from somewhere else. At a gathering where relatives from outside Seoul visited, Seo Yeon introduced everyone in the room except Amara, and then smiled at Amara afterward with a warmth that was so perfectly engineered it would have taken a photograph to prove it was false. And some of the household staff watched all of this and drew their own conclusions. Within a month, the housekeeper, who had initially been warm and helpful, began averting her eyes when Amara entered a room. One of the kitchen staff started running small requests past Misuk rather than Amara, even when Amara was the one who'd made them. A groundskeeper's assistant stopped saying good morning. Amara noticed all of it. She was not naive. She was not oblivious. She simply could not bring herself to tell Tae-jin, because every time she constructed the sentence in her head, "Your mother made me stand in the hallway while your family had tea," she heard how it would land, saw the look that would cross his face, felt the chain reaction she was not ready to set off. She loved him. That's the whole explanation, as insufficient as it sounds. She loved him, and she'd watched the way he carried the weight of his family's expectations and his organization's demands, and she could not make herself add her pain to that pile. So she held it, and they took it as permission to add more. The necklace had come from Tae-jin on the night after their wedding. Not at the reception, not during the ceremony. After, when they were finally alone, in the quiet of their hotel room, and he'd sat beside her on the edge of the bed and taken a small box from his jacket pocket with the sheepishness of a man who wasn't used to giving gifts and wasn't sure he'd gotten it right. "It was my grandmother's," he said, "my father's mother. She gave it to me when I was 22, said I'd know when to give it." Amara had opened the box, a delicate chain with a pendant traditional in design, clearly old in the way that meant someone had worn it every day for a long time. "Did you know?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "I've been carrying it for 3 years." She put it on herself, her fingers shaking slightly, in a way she hoped he didn't see, but he probably did, because he always noticed, and it settled against her collarbone, like it had always meant to be there. She'd worn it every day since, when my Suk reached out and took it from her neck in front of 12 guests. She wasn't just taking jewelry. She knew that. Amara knew that, and from the smile on Seo Yeon's face in that moment, that quick satisfied twitch of the corner of her mouth that she didn't quite manage to suppress, Seo Yeon knew that too. The luncheon had started at noon. Amara had heard them arriving from upstairs, the cars, the voices, the particular sound the house made when it was filling with people Mi-suk wanted to impress. She'd taken her time getting ready, chosen a dress she felt confident in, done her makeup carefully, not because she needed armor, but because she wanted it, pressed her shoulders back in front of the mirror and told herself, "You live here. You have every right to walk down those stairs." She had made it to the 7th step when Seo Yeon appeared at the bottom. She wasn't blocking the staircase. That would have been too obvious. She was simply standing there, one hand resting on the banister, looking up at Amara, with an expression that managed to combine pity and amusement in a ratio specifically designed to be destabilizing. "Where are you going?" she asked. The question had the tone of an adult, asking a child who had wandered into the wrong room. "Downstairs," Amara said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "We have guests." "I know. That's why I'm coming down." Seo Yeon tilted her head, just slightly. "Amara." She said the name the way someone might say a word in a language they considered minor. "These are Mother's guests. Business connections. Important ones." A small pause. "You understand." "I understand that I live here," Amara said. "And I'm coming down to lunch." She kept walking. Seo Yeon didn't physically stop her. She didn't need to. She simply turned and walked back into the room ahead of Amara, and by the time Amara reached the bottom of the staircase, every head in the room had turned, summoned by some invisible signal that Seo Yeon had managed to generate without appearing to do anything at all, and the weight of all those eyes, assessing, landed on Amara at once. And that was when Mi-suk spoke. Her voice carried across the room with the practiced ease of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her own authority in any space she occupied. "There you are. She said not warmly, not coldly, but in the specific register that made Amara's stomach drop. The dining room needs attention before we sit. Go help Hai-rin with the table setting. Hai-rin was one of the household staff. The room didn't go silent. That would have required a dramatic beat that Mi-suk, with her preference for controlled humiliation, would never have permitted. Instead, conversations continued at a slightly lower volume. One woman near the window adjusted her bracelet. A man beside her said something quietly. That made his companion nod. And everyone pretended not to have heard what they had clearly just heard. Apara stood at the bottom of the staircase in her carefully chosen dress and felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, not exactly, but opening. Like the difference between a window with a chip in it and a window that has just been told there are 12 more chips on the way. She did not move toward the dining room. She did not help Hai-rin with the table setting. She also did not say anything. Not yet. She was not ready yet. She walked to a chair at the edge of the room and she sat down, and she stayed there, quiet and upright, while Mi-suk's luncheon swirled around her, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been placed slightly inconveniently, and no one could quite decide whether to move it or work around it. What happened next? The remarks Seo Yeon made that drew laughter from two of the guests. The moment Mi-suk asked Amara to fetch water from the kitchen. The deliberate choreography of small indignities that built like pressure behind a sealed door. All of that would matter. All of that is part of this story. But the moment that finally cracked the seal, the moment that pulled Amara's silence out of her by the root, was when Mi-suk walked toward her with the necklace already in her hand. She had taken it while Amara was distracted. During one of the moments when someone had asked Amara a question, a guest, speaking to her with what Amara had thought was genuine curiosity. And while she was answering, Mi-suk had simply reached out and undone the clasp at the back of her neck. Like removing something that had been left in the wrong place. Something belonging to this family, Mi-suk said, holding the necklace in her palm, should be worn by someone who belongs to this family. Seo Yeon's laugh was soft, polished, the kind that exists only to let you know you've been seen and found wanting. None of them heard the front door open. None of them noticed the shadow in the entrance hall. Amara looked at the necklace in her mother-in-law's hand, the necklace Tae-jin had carried for 3 years, waiting for the right person. The necklace that had belonged to his grandmother. The necklace she had worn every single day since the night after their wedding, and she felt the last wire holding her composure in place go taut. Then she opened her mouth, and everything changed. The silence that followed Mi-suk's words had a texture to it. Not the clean, dramatic silence of a movie, the kind with swelling music underneath and perfectly lit faces, holding perfectly composed expressions. This was the other kind, the kind that has embarrassment in it, and discomfort, and the particular awkwardness of 12 people who all understood exactly what had just happened and had collectively decided to pretend they hadn't. Amara stood at the center of that silence and felt every second of it against her skin. The necklace was in Mi-suk's hand, her hand, the hand of a woman who had not made one sincere gesture toward Amara in the 8 months since Tae-jin had brought her home. Pendant caught the afternoon light coming through the dining room window, small, gold, old in a way that meant something, and Amara looked at it and thought, very clearly, without any drama, no. Not out loud. Not yet. Just that single, quiet word, sitting behind her sternum like a stone. Mi-suk was already turning away, already moving back toward her guests, with the necklace folded in her palm, as though the matter was settled. As though Amara's silence, in this moment, like every other moment, was confirmation that she could be handled this way, without consequence. Seo Yeon hadn't moved from her position near the window. She had a glass in her hand, juice, not wine. Barely past noon, and she was watching Amara with the specific expression of someone's been waiting for this scene for a long time and is enjoying the fact that it's finally playing out the way they'd imagined. One of the guests, an older woman in a pale green dress, who had been sitting near the far end of the table, reached for her own glass and looked deliberately at the wall. The household staff moved through the edges of the room with the careful efficiency of people who have learned that the best response to a dangerous situation is to become invisible. Amara breathed in, breathed out, and spoke. I'm going to need that back. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It came out even and direct, the way a simple true statement comes out when you've stopped trying to protect anyone's feelings with the shape of your words. My-suk stopped walking. She didn't turn around right away. That pause, 2, maybe 3 seconds, was itself a statement. The pause of a woman deciding whether this moment was worth her attention. She turned. "Excuse me," she said. The Korean came out sharp and clean, and Amara's Korean was still imperfect, still accented, still carried her Chicago roots in it, the way a second language always carries the ghost of the first, but she understood the tone perfectly. It wasn't a question, it was a gate closing. "The necklace," Amara said. "It belongs to me. My husband gave it to me. I need it back." Something moved through the room. Not sound. More like a collective intake of breath that nobody actually took. Seofian set her glass down on the windowsill. My-suk tilted her head in a way that Amara had come to recognize the slight angle, the composed mouth, the eyes that didn't change as the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had been wanting to say for a long time and had finally decided the opportunity was right. "Your husband," Mi-suk said, switching to English with the precision of someone choosing a weapon, "gave you a piece of this family's history. That does not make it yours. He gave it to his wife," Amara said. "That makes it mine. You are his wife." Mi-suk said the word the way someone might say temporary. That is a legal fact. It is not the same as belonging here. Amara's jaw was tight. She could feel it, the tension in the hinge of it, the way her back teeth wanted to press together. She forced her hands to stay loose at her sides. "I live in this house," she said. "You live in my son's house," Mi-suk corrected. "There is a difference. One day perhaps you'll understand that." "I understand it now," Amara said. "I've understood it since the first week. What I don't understand is why understanding it means I'm supposed to be treated like I don't matter." That word matter landed differently than the others. She felt it when she said it. Not because she raised her voice, but because it was the first time in 8 months she had said anything even close to the truth inside these walls. And the truth, even spoken quietly, has a weight that's different from everything else. My-suk looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the necklace in her own hand. Then she looked back at Amara. "Marrying Tae-jin," she said, each word measured and deliberate, "may have given you his surname. It did not give you our family's respect. Respect is earned. Over time. Through conduct. Through understanding your place." "My place," Amara repeated. "Yes, my place in my own home." Mi-suk's expression didn't shift. Tae-jin's home. For a moment, just a moment, Amara almost lost it. Not in the way that would have given them ammunition, not tears or raised voice or anything that could be pointed at later as evidence of instability. Just a flicker, somewhere behind her eyes, that people who knew her well would have recognized as the moment the last patient, reasonable, accommodating part of her finally decided it was done cooperating. Seo Yin chose that exact moment to speak. Amara, her voice was almost gentle. That was the most vicious thing about Seo Yin. She had learned to weaponize gentleness. "We're trying to help you. If you can't accept your position here, if you're going to make scenes like this in front of guests." "Like this?" Amara turned to look at her directly. "Your mother just took jewelry off my body, in my own home, in front of 12 people, and I'm the one making a scene?" Seo Yeon's mouth opened slightly. Just slightly. It was the first time in 8 months that Amara had spoken to her with anything other than carefully maintained civility, and the surprise of it was visible, quickly controlled, but visible. "You're being dramatic," Seo Yin said. "I'm being accurate," Amara said. "Those are different things." One of the male guests near the table cleared his throat and said something quietly to the woman beside him. She nodded without looking at anyone. Mi-suk was still holding the necklace. "If you cannot accept the way things work in this family," she said, back to Korean now, slower, as though making sure Amara would follow every word, "then perhaps you should think seriously about whether this marriage is right for you. For both of you." The room went very still, even Seo Yeon didn't move. Because everyone in that room understood what Mi-suk had just said, underneath the surface of what she'd said. She hadn't said, leave the luncheon. She hadn't said go upstairs. She had said, with the precision of a woman who had been building to this moment for 8 months, leave my son. Amara looked at her mother-in-law for a long time. She thought about Dorothy at O'Hare, tissue pressed to her lip. She thought about the morning of the 3rd week, eating dinner in this house with a small serpent plate. She thought about the tea gathering, standing in the hallway, counting to 4 before she turned around. She thought about every morning she had come downstairs and said good morning to Hyrin and gotten a response that had gotten progressively shorter over the preceding months. And she thought about the exact moment she had realized why and what she had done about it, which was nothing, because she had been trying so hard to keep the peace that she had let the peace be used as a way to take things from her. I never asked for your wealth, she said. Her voice was quiet and unhurried and very clear. I never asked for your approval. I never asked for your name or your status or whatever it is your family thinks it has that makes it different from anyone else. I married your son because I love him. And every single day since I came to this house, I have tried with more patience than you deserve to make this work, to show respect, to understand the culture, to learn your language. She paused. I never asked for anything except to be treated like a human being. Nobody said anything. That was apparently too much to ask, she said. Mai Suk's face had not changed during any of this. That was the thing about Mai Suk. She had spent decades behind a face that would not give anything away to anyone who didn't already know where to look. But her hand, the one holding the necklace, had closed slightly. Just slightly. The fingers curling inward. Seo-yeon broke first. You don't understand what this family has sacrificed, she said, and her voice had lost some of its polish. There was something rawer underneath it now. Something that sounded closer to genuine emotion than anything she'd shown in Amara's presence before. What we've given up, what it costs to carry a name like ours. My brother works every day under pressure that would break someone like. She stopped herself. Someone like me? Amara said. The correction had been automatic. She hadn't planned it. Seo-yeon's jaw tightened. That's not what I said. It's what you almost said. You're putting words in my... Seo-yeon, ah. Mi-suk's voice cut through cleanly, and Seo-yeon went quiet immediately, the way she always did when her mother used that particular tone. A lifetime of conditioning working exactly as designed. Mi-suk looked at Amara. Then she did something unexpected. She walked to the table and set the necklace down on the surface between them. Not handed it back, set it down, the way you set down something that is no longer your concern. Take it, she said simply, and think about what I said. Amara picked up the necklace. Her hands were steady. She was extremely proud of how steady her hands were. She put the necklace in the pocket of her dress because she was not going to stand in front of 12 witnesses and fumble with a clasp at the back of her own neck. She looked at Mi-suk one more time. Then she walked to the nearest chair at the dining table, not the edge, not the seat that had been subtly placed slightly separate from the rest, and she sat down. Like she belonged there, because she did. The silence stretched for 3 long, uncomfortable seconds. Then one of the male guests, a heavy-set man in his late 50s, who had said very little during all of this, picked up his chopsticks and looked at the food in front of him and said something to the man beside him about the weather next week. And the luncheon lurched forward. Seo-yeon did not sit down immediately. She stayed by the window for another moment, watching Amara with an expression that had moved past surprise into something more complicated. Something that looked, underneath the careful surface of it, like a calculation being revised. When she finally sat, she sat across the table from Amara and slightly to the left, not directly facing her, but not turned away. A middle position, unresolved. The meal was served. Conversations resumed. The way conversations at formal gatherings, because always eventually resume regardless of what has just happened, because people have social momentum requires them to eat it and talk about something. The weather, a recent event, someone's business trip. Amara ate. She did not talk much. She answered when spoken to a guest, asked where in America she was from, and she said Chicago, and the man nodded and said he had been once for a conference. Very cold. Very tall buildings, and she kept her face in the particular configuration of composed that she had practiced for months in rooms that hadn't wanted her. But something was different now. The thing she had been holding for 8 months, the weight of all that swallowed restraint was sitting differently in her body. Lighter in some places, heavier in others. Like she had finally put something down that she'd been carrying. For so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. But her muscles still remembered the effort of holding it and hadn't quite adjusted to the change. My-suk, at the head of the table, performed graciousness with expert facility, laughed at the right moments, asked after children and business ventures and a recent trip someone had taken, refilled glasses with a gesture so well practiced it looked effortless. If a stranger had walked in off the street, they would have seen a composed, elegant woman hosting a pleasant family luncheon. Seo Yeon, who had grown up watching Mi-suk perform this way, matched it almost perfectly. Almost. There were moments, Amara cataloged them quietly, not out of spite, but out of the particular alertness that develops in anyone who has spent months reading a room for danger when Seon's timing was a fraction off. A laugh that came a half-second late, a response to a guest's comment that was slightly disconnected from what they'd actually said. She was thinking about something. Amara was thinking about something too. She was thinking about what Mi-suk had said. Perhaps you should think seriously about whether this marriage is right for you. The directness of it, not even trying to disguise it as concern, just laying it down flat on the table like an invoice. She was thinking about the fact that she had not told Tae-jin. Not once. Not about the third-week dinner. Not about the tea gathering. Not about the way the household staff had shifted. Not about the 100 smaller moments that had preceded this afternoon. She had assembled, in her silence, a complete and detailed record of everything that had happened to her in this house, and she had shared none of it with the man she had married. Because she told herself she was protecting him. But sitting at that table, with the necklace in her pocket and the taste of the afternoon in the back of her throat, she thought, protecting him from what? Exactly. The truth about his own family? And what does it say about me that I thought the kindest thing I could do was let them keep doing this? Thought sat in her chest, uncomfortable and accurate. She had not just been protecting him. She had been protecting herself from the conversation that starts with "your mother took a necklace off my neck" and ended somewhere much harder to navigate. From the moment when the problem stopped being something she could manage quietly in her own head and became something that required her husband to choose between her and the family he'd grown up in. From the look on his face when he understood how long it had been going on and realized she'd hidden it from him. That was the fear she hadn't named. Not that he would choose wrong. That he would choose right, and the cost of the right choice would be something she'd caused. The guests began leaving around 3:30. The goodbyes were polished handshakes and cheek-adjacent greetings, and promises to connect soon that had the warmth of social habit rather than genuine intention. Mi-suk moved through the departures smoothly, the perfect hostess right to the end. One woman paused near Amara on the way out and said quietly, in careful English, "Your dress is very beautiful," with an expression that held something Amara couldn't quite categorize: sympathy, maybe, or just recognition, and then moved on before Amara could respond. When the last car pulled out of the drive, the house went quiet. The particular quiet of an empty formal space after a gathering the kind, where you can suddenly hear small sounds that were there all along, the refrigerator from the kitchen, the wind outside, the soft footsteps of Hyrin beginning to clear the table. Setseo Sion was sitting in an armchair near the window, doing something on her phone, or pretending to. Mi-suk was standing near the sideboard with her back to the room, rearranging something that didn't need rearranging. Amara was still at the table. She should have left. Probably. Gone upstairs and taken the afternoon apart quietly, in the privacy of the room she shared with her husband. But she was tired, not sleepy, the other kind of tired. The kind that sets into your bones after months of sustained effort. And she didn't quite have the energy to stand up and walk away with the particular controlled grace she'd been maintaining for the last 3 hours. So she sat, and the silence in the room built itself into something with edges. Seo-yeon spoke first. She put her phone down on the arm of the chair and looked directly at Amara, and her voice when she spoke was quieter than it had been during the luncheon, less performed, less polished. Something more like how she probably talked when she wasn't in front of an audience. You should know, she said, that what my mother said wasn't cruelty. She's trying to protect Tae-jin. Amara looked at her. From his wife. From a choice he made too quickly. Without thinking it through. He's 35 years old. He's 35 years old who has spent the last decade running an organization that would collapse without him, carrying a family that depends on his judgment, making decisions that cost actual consequences when they're wrong. Seo-yeon's voice was steady, reasonable, the tone of someone making an argument they believe. And then he meets someone at a conference, and 8 months later she's living in this house. That's not thinking it through. That's feeling something and acting on it. Which is not something our family can afford. Your family, Amara said, doesn't get to decide what Tae-jin can afford. We literally do, Seo-yeon said, not unkind. Just factual. Accept that or not. Mi-suk had turned around. She was standing near the sideboard, with her hands folded in front of her, listening, and when Amara looked at her, there was something in her face that was different from what it had been during the luncheon. Less performance, more of the actual woman underneath it, which was not softer, but was at least more honest. Seo-yeon is right, Mi-suk said. I have nothing against you personally. That's an interesting way to describe what just happened, Amara said. I am describing what is true. Mi-suk's voice was even. My son did not consult this family. He did not bring you to meet us before the decision was made. He came home with a wife, from another country, from a background we know nothing about, and expected us to simply accommodate that. You're angry at him, Amara said slowly. Something shifted in Mi-suk's face, just slightly. Kind of shift that means a thought has been confirmed rather than introduced. I am concerned, she said, about my son. Then talk to your son, Amara said. Not his necklace. The silence after that was different from the others. Sharper. The kind that follows a true thing said out loud in a room that wasn't ready for it. Seo-yeon was looking at her mother with an expression Amara couldn't fully read, somewhere between wariness and curiosity. Mi-suk was looking at Amara with the fixed, evaluating attention of someone who has just recalibrated something in their head. And then Seo-yeon said what she said. Later, in the weeks that followed, Amara would try to determine whether Seo-yeon said it on purpose, or whether it was genuinely just the kind of thing that comes out when someone has spent months feeling something and has finally decided, consciously or not, that holding it in is too much work. My brother may love you outside this house, Seo-yeon said. Her voice was quiet, clear, completely without the performance of the earlier afternoon. Inside it, you will never be one of us. Amara's breath went very still in her chest. She looked at Seo-yeon, at the flat certainty in her face, at the fact that there was no cruelty in the expression, or rather, that the cruelty was so deeply integrated into the statement that Seo-yeon herself didn't experience it as cruel. She was simply saying what she believed to be true, in the same way someone says the sky is that color or water moves downhill. Completely without apology, completely without doubt. And Mi-suk, standing by the sideboard, did not contradict her daughter. That was the part that took the last of it, not the words. The silence that followed them. The fact that Mi-suk, who had spoken so deliberately about concern for her son, about doing what was best for the family, did not say one word to qualify what Seo-yeon had just told Amara about her place in this house, in this family, in this life she had built from a departure gate in O'Hare and a year of Korean language lessons and 100 small daily choices to be patient and steady and good. Amara was going to respond. She had something forming calm, clear, the kind of sentence that lands without flinching. She never got to say it, because behind Seo-yeon, from the direction of the entrance hall, came a voice. A man's voice, low and unhurried, and absolutely certain of itself in the way that only belongs to people who have never once in their adult life walked into a room they weren't prepared to own. Then perhaps this is no longer your house. The room stopped. Not the breathing people kept breathing. Physically, they had to, but everything else. Every movement, every ambient sound. particular, suspended quality of a moment where something has shifted so completely and so fast that the brain needs an extra second to. The word landed in the room before anyone had processed where it came from. House. Seo Yin turned first. She turned the way people turn when they hear a sound that shouldn't be there, fast, instinctive, without the social grace she normally maintained in every movement. Her glass, which she had picked back up at some point during the last exchange, tilted in her hand, and a thin line of juice ran over the rim and down her wrist, and she didn't notice. Mysuk turned slower. That was the difference between them, and it said everything about the difference between them. Seo Yon's youth, giving her body to her reactions before her mind could intercept them. Misuk's decades of discipline, holding her face in place even as her blood pressure did whatever it was doing behind it. Tae-jin was standing in the entrance to the room. He was still in his coat. The good one, the dark charcoal that his assistant had selected for the Busan meetings, with the collar turned up slightly from the wind outside. His tie was loosened by exactly one pull. He had the look of a man who had driven fast from somewhere and hadn't been intending to stop, and then stopped. His eyes moved through the room in the specific, practiced way they always moved through rooms, cataloging, assigning, concluding, and they did this in approximately 2 seconds, and then they settled on Amara and they stopped moving. She was still sitting at the table. She hadn't stood up when he appeared. Her legs had simply not sent the right message to her brain in time to make that happen, and so she was sitting there in her dress with one hand flat on the tablecloth, and her face showing. She was fairly certain, more than she would have chosen to show if she had been given a second to prepare. He had heard. She could see that he had heard. Not from anything specific in his expression. His expression was controlled in the way that his mother's was controlled. That particular Quan stillness that had always coexisted strangely with how open he was when it was just the two of them, but from something underneath the control. Something sitting behind his eyes that hadn't been there. The last time she'd seen him, 3 mornings ago when he'd left for Busan with his briefcase and a coffee he didn't finish, and a kiss pressed to the top of her head. He'd heard, and from the way he was standing very still, coat on, one hand at his side and the other barely touching the doorframe, like a man who has arrived at a scene and is deciding what kind of man to be in it, he had heard more than just Seo Yeon's last sentence. Tae-jin. Misuk's voice was measured, careful in a way it almost never was. We didn't expect you back until, I know, he said. 2 words. Quiet. Final in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Misuk closed her mouth. Seo Yeon had finally noticed the juice on her wrist. She set the glass down on the windowsill and pressed the back of her hand against her skirt, in a gesture back of hand against her skirt, in a gesture that was so automatic, the gesture of someone caught in something and looking for a way to tidy themselves while they figured out what to do next. Tae-jin walked into the room. He didn't rush. He never rushed. It was one of the things Amara had learned about him in the months before they married, that his pace in any situation was always exactly the same, unhurried and deliberate, and that this consistency was itself a form of authority. Urgency for Tae-jin was something that happened to other people. Or at least, that was how he appeared. What was happening inside him in any given moment was information he shared with very few people. He walked past Seo Yeon without looking at her, past the table with its post-luncheon state glasses, half empty, a serving dish with food remaining, the small disorder of a meal that had ended without proper ceremony. He stopped in front of Amara. He looked at her for a long moment. Just looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the room behind them, and the 2 women in it might as well have dissolved for those few seconds. "Are you all right?" he asked, in English, quietly. It was such an ordinary question, the kind of question that gets asked in kitchens and car rides and ordinary moments. The kind of question that, in ordinary circumstances, doesn't carry any particular weight. Amara's throat did something she hadn't given it permission to do. She pressed her lips together briefly. "Yes," she said. The way she said it answered a different question. Tae-jin held her gaze for another second. Then he straightened and turned, and the temperature of the room changed. He looked at his mother. "How long?" he said. Mysuk raised her chin. Tae-jin, if you would allow me to, how long has this been happening? Not a question. The absence of the question mark made it something else. An instruction to deliver information, the kind of instruction that in his professional life meant that the person receiving it understood exactly what kind of man was waiting for the answer. My-suk was his mother. She had known him for 35 years. She was not easily frightened by anyone, including her son. But she did not answer immediately. That silence was its own answer. Tae-jin turned to look at Amara, and this was the moment she had been afraid of for 8 months. Not this exact configuration of it, not with the luncheon debris on the table, and the juice drying on Seo Yeon's wrist, and the afternoon light going gray through the windows, but this moment. The one where she had to look at her husband and tell him the truth. She'd been swallowing since the 3rd week. How long, Amara? His voice when he said her name was different from how it usually was. Not harder. Something more painful than hard. Something that understood already, from the way she was sitting, and the fact that she hadn't been able to say yes, like she meant it, that the answer was going to be longer than he wanted it to be. Exhaled. Since the beginning, she said. The room was so quiet that the refrigerator sound from the kitchen was clearly audible. Tae-jin stood very still. Then he turned to the entrance of the room and spoke toward the hallway, where 2 members of his security team had materialized at some point in the last few minutes with the unobtrusive efficiency that characterized everyone in his employment. "Get me Park and the estate manager," he said. "Now." One of them disappeared. Seo Yeon made a small sound. Not a word, something more involuntary than a word. Something that came from the stomach and bypassed the brain on the way out. "Tae-jin, she started. "Don't." He didn't look at her. "Not yet," she closed her mouth. The look on her face was complicated, not the polished cruelty of the afternoon, not the careful social management she'd maintained through the luncheon. Something younger and more frightened. The face of someone who has just realized that the context they've been operating in for the last several months has changed completely, and they do not yet know what the context contains or what it will cost them. Mi-suk was watching her son with an expression that Amara had never seen on her face before. Not fear exactly. Mi-suk was not a woman who wore fear on her face, or possibly was not a woman who felt it in the simple way that word usually meant, but something that was adjacent to it. Recalibration. The look of a woman who has been playing a long game with complete confidence and has just heard the board reset. Tae-jin sat down. He sat down across from Amara at the table, in the chair that had been occupied by one of the luncheon guests less than an hour ago, and he leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at her with his full attention. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not all of it, not with his mother and sister standing 15 feet away, and the estate manager not yet arrived, and the afternoon still raw in the room, but enough. The 3rd week dinner, the tea gathering in the hall, the household staff, the slow, careful architecture of exclusion that had been constructed around her while he was in Busan or in meetings, or sleeping in the same bed as her at night, unaware of what the house was doing to her while he was in it. She kept her voice steady. She was aware of Mi-suk behind her, and Seo Yeon near the window, and she kept her voice steady, the way you keep a flame steady in a wind, not by pretending the wind isn't there, but by cupping both hands around it. Tae-jin listened without interrupting. This was something she had noticed about him in the months they'd been together. When something mattered, he went very still and listened without filling the space with his own reactions. It was a rare quality, and she had loved it in small moments. In this moment it was almost unbearable, because his stillness gave her nothing to read, nothing to prepare for, and she was delivering the story of 8 months of being erased in her own home, to a face that was giving her almost nothing back. When she finished, he sat there for 3 seconds. Then he looked at his mother. "You took the necklace from her," he said. My-suk's jaw was set. "I said what I said. I stand by it. That necklace belonged to my grandmother, which is precisely why I gave it to my wife." His voice dropped on the last word rather than rising, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "You put your hands on something I gave to my wife. In her own home, in front of strangers. I did what I believed was." "I'm not finished." My-suk went quiet. "Park Jae-ho, The estate manager appeared in the doorway, a compact, careful man in his 50s who had worked for the Kwan estate for 19 years and had the particular quality of someone who has seen a great many things in that time and learned to respond to all of them with the same measured professionalism. Behind him, the security chief, Choi Dong-wook, whose job it was to know everything that happened on the property, and who, Amara thought distantly, had therefore known about at least some of what had been happening and had not told his employer. Tae-jin looked at Park first. "Were you aware," he said, "of what was happening to my wife in this house?" Park Jae-ho was a man who did not lie to his employer. It was the foundation his 19 years of employment were built on. "I was aware of some of it," he said. "I did not believe it was my place to mind." "You work for this household," Tae-jin said. "My wife is the lady of this household. If something is done to her in this house that she has not authorized, it is directly your concern." A pause. "That's a failing. I'm going to address it." Park's face was professionally neutral. "Yes, sir." Tae-jin looked at Choi, same question. Choi Dong-wook was quieter than Park. He was the kind of man who made his living knowing things and knowing when to deploy what he knew, and the calculation that moved through his face in the moment before he answered was visible to Amara, even from where she was sitting. "I was aware," he said. The two words fell into the room like stones. Tae-jin looked at him for a long moment. Choi had worked for him for 11 years. He was effective and loyal, and had, on 2 occasions that Amara only knew about in vague outline, been the reason Tae-jin was still alive to come home and make coffee with his sleeves pushed up in the morning. "You'll have the evening to think about whether your assessment of where your loyalty lies was correct," Tae-jin said. "We'll speak tomorrow." Choi nodded once, understood. Seo-yeon had moved slightly, not toward the door, not toward her brother, but in the small, instinctive shift of someone whose body is trying to decide whether flight or argument is the right response and hasn't committed either way. "Tae-jin," she said. Her voice had lost its social gloss entirely. This was the raw version, younger, less certain. The voice of the girl she'd been before this family's name had become something she wore like a second skin. "You have to understand, we were trying to protect." "Who?" he said. She blinked. "What? Who were you protecting?" Question sat there. Simple, brutal in its simplicity. "You," she said. "We were protecting you. She came in from nowhere, Appa. You know nothing about her family. You know nothing about what she wants. You married her after 8 months, without asking anyone, without—" "I asked her," Tae-jin said. "That's not what I asked the person I was marrying," he said. "I didn't need your permission. I didn't need Mother's permission. I needed Amara's answer, and she gave it, and that was the end of the conversation." He paused. "Everything that's happened in this house since then has been a response to a decision you were not consulted about and couldn't change. Is that correct?" Seo-yeon's mouth was pressed tight. Her eyes were bright in the way that could mean anger, or could mean something she would die before letting fall in front of this room. "You're choosing her over your family," she said. "I'm enforcing a choice I already made 8 months ago, that my family has been refusing to accept." He looked at her steadily. "That's different." Mi-suk spoke. Her voice, when it came, was different from anything Amara had heard from her before. Still controlled, but the control was doing more work than usual, which meant the thing underneath it was larger than usual, and the edges of that larger thing were showing. "You want to talk about choices," Mi-suk said. "Fine. Let's talk about choices. Your father's choice was this family, this name, this organization above everything. Everything personal came second. He understood that the work required sacrifice, and he made those sacrifices without being asked, and you inherited everything he built because he was willing to do that." She paused. "And you look at me right now like I'm the villain." Tae-jin looked at his mother for a long time. "My father," he said slowly, "was not happy." The silence after that sentence had a quality unlike any of the others. Because Mi-suk's face did something in it, something small, something that passed quickly, something that looked uncomfortably like truth being touched somewhere it hadn't expected contact. "My father ran this family and ran this organization and sacrificed every personal thing on the altar of the name," Tae-jin continued. "And he died at 61 with high blood pressure and 3 months of vacation in his entire adult life and a marriage that had been cordial for 30 years. That was the inheritance I got alongside the business. He looked at his mother. I don't want that inheritance. Mi-suk said nothing. I found someone, he said. Someone who, when I come home, I want to be in the room she's in. That's a simple thing. It's the simplest thing. And you have spent 8 months trying to take it from me, while I was busy making sure this family has money and safety and a name worth carrying. Did you not think I would find out? I thought, Mi-suk said, that eventually she would understand. Understand what? That she is tolerated here, that she has to earn her place in her own home, that the woman I married doesn't deserve the basic. He stopped. His jaw was tight. He looked down at the table for a moment and then back up. You humiliated her. In my house. In front of strangers. You took something I gave her off her body. The last sentence came out quieter than the others, which made it worse. And she didn't tell me. She didn't tell me because she was trying to protect me from a conflict with my own family. My wife was protecting me from you. The room was very still. Seo. Yeon had stopped trying to look composed. She was looking at her brother with an expression that had moved fully into something Amara hadn't seen from her before, not calculation, not performance, but a kind of stunned reevaluation. As though Tae-jin had just said something that rearranged a load-bearing wall in her understanding of the last 8 months. And then Tae-jin reached into his jacket pocket. He set something on the table. It was the necklace. Amara had forgotten in the dislocation of the last half hour, in the managed chaos of Tae-jin appearing and the room reshaping itself around his presence, that she had put it in her pocket. He had taken it at some point, in the last few minutes, in some moment she hadn't tracked, with the particular sleight-of-hand competency of a man accustomed to moving through situations and gathering relevant information without advertising the action. He picked it up from the table. He stood. He walked to Amara's chair. She stood without being asked. He put the necklace back around her neck. His fingers at the clasp were steady and certain and took exactly 3 seconds. And when the pendant settled back against her collarbone, he kept his hands on her shoulders for a moment, just a moment, and looked at her with an expression she recognized from the quiet hours of their mornings, the version of him that wasn't for anyone else. Then he turned back to the room. Amara does not need to earn her place in the Kwan family, he said. I chose her. She is the reason I come home. Anyone who cannot respect that choice is free to leave this house. Mi-suk's face had gone through several configurations in the last few minutes and had arrived at something settled and still, and very old in the way that grief is old, not the emotion itself, but the shape of it. The worn-in look of a feeling that has been carried for a long time and is finally being named. You would choose her, she said, over your mother. I would choose my wife, Tae-jin said, over anyone who treats her the way you have treated her. That includes you. It would include anyone. That's not a threat. It's just the most honest thing I know how to say right now. And Amara, who had held herself in careful stillness through all of this, through the recounting, through the confrontation, through the weight of being talked about and talked for, and finally defended in the room where she had swallowed 8 months of small destructions, Amara spoke. Tae-jin. He looked at her. I don't want them gone, she said. The room registered this differently than it had registered anything else, because it was unexpected from Seo Yeon, who clearly had braced for some kind of exile, who had moved slightly toward the door in the past few minutes with the half-unconscious preparation of someone expecting to be told to leave. From Mi-suk, whose stillness took on a different quality. Even from Tae-jin, whose attention shifted with the particular sharpness of a man who has been surprised by the person he knows best. What do you want? He asked. She thought about Dorothy at the gate. She thought about the Korean lessons every morning. She thought about the gift she'd brought Mi-suk, the silk scarf, the practice greeting, the hope she'd carried through that introduction, like something cupped in 2 hands. I want to be treated like I exist, she said. I want it to stop. I want, if there's going to be a family dinner, I want to sit at the table like everyone else. I want the staff to know who I am in this house. I want your mother and your sister to be in my life because families are supposed to be in each other's lives, but I want it to be actual, not this. Not what this has been. She paused. I don't want revenge. I want it to actually stop. Hyo Yin was looking at her with an expression that Amara could not entirely read. Mi-suk was looking at her with an expression that was even harder to read, which was a different thing. Mi-suk's face being difficult to read had always meant containment, but the quality of the containment was different now. Like something had been opened that she was now having to decide whether to close back up or leave open and deal with. Tae-jin looked at his wife. All right, he said. Then he looked at Park. Any employee who participated in making my wife feel unwelcome in this house is no longer employed here. Give me the names by tonight. He looked at Choi. We'll have our conversation tomorrow. Clear your schedule. He looked at Seo Yeon. Your access to the family accounts is suspended. If you want to argue about it, we'll do that privately. Not today. Finally, he looked at Mi-suk. You won't be managing this household anymore. That authority transfers to Amara. Completely. Mi-suk held herself very straight. And if I find that disagreeable, she said, then you have the same choice I just offered everyone else, Tae-jin said. You're my mother. There is nothing in my life that removes that. But this, he gestured, briefly, at the room, at the afternoon, at the 8 months of architecture that had been built in his absence. This is finished. Mi-suk looked at her son for a long moment. Then she looked at Amara. And Amara looked back at her, at this woman who had taken a necklace from her neck in front of an audience, who had ordered her to help the staff, who had suggested she consider leaving her marriage, who had built a careful and expert campaign of diminishment for 8 months, and held her gaze without looking away. Mi-suk reached up and smoothed the front of her jacket. Small gesture. Self-composing, I see, she said. That was all. She turned and walked from the room. Seo Yeon watched her mother go. Then she looked at Tae-jin, and then at Amara, and then at the floor. And the look on her face in that moment was the most unguarded Amara had ever seen it. The looks of someone young enough to still be surprised by consequences, and old enough to understand, with a sinking, unwilling clarity, that she had done something she couldn't simply style her way out of. She left without saying anything. The room was empty, except for Tae-jin and Amara and the post-luncheon remains of a table neither of them was looking at. Tae-jin sat down, not at the head of the table, in the same chair he'd been in before, across from Amara, elbows on the table. He pressed the heels of his hands briefly against his eyes, and then dropped them. I'm sorry, he said. Amara sat back down across from him. You didn't know. I should have. He looked at her. I should have paid attention. She didn't tell him he was right, because he was right, and saying so wouldn't help anything. She didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't. She looked at him across the table, this man who had carried a necklace for 3 years and learned her mother's printer model and made coffee with his sleeves, pushed up, and never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was, and she said, You know now, he exhaled. Yeah, he said, I do. Outside the light through the windows had gone the particular gray of Seoul's late afternoon, and somewhere deeper in the house a door closed with the soft, final sound of a woman reassessing the architecture of her authority. And downstairs in the kitchen, Hai Rin was quietly finishing the clearing of a table where everything had been decided, and Amara sat in the room that was now officially, explicitly, finally hers, and understood with the particular exhaustion of someone who has just survived something large that surviving it was only the beginning, and what came next would require something she hadn't yet needed to find in herself, not patience, not restraint, not careful quiet management of other people's cruelty, but the harder and stranger work of building something real in the space where all of that had been. She reached across the table. Tae-jin's hand met hers halfway. Neither of them said anything for a long time. And somewhere above them, in a room at the end of the east corridor, Kwon Mi-suk sat on the edge of a chair she had occupied for 30 years, and looked at a wall and thought about a woman who had just refused to ask for revenge and began, against every instinct she'd built her life on, to wonder if she had. The night after the luncheon, nobody slept well in the Kwon estate. Amara knew this not because she heard anyone, but because the house had a particular quality of wakeful silence, the kind that comes from multiple people lying in separate rooms with their eyes open. processing the same event from different angles and arriving at different levels of terror about what morning would bring. The old building made its sounds, the way old buildings do. Pipes settling, wind finding the gap under the east corridor door that the maintenance staff had been meaning to fix for months. The occasional creak of floorboards that had been absorbing the weight of this family for 30 years. She lay on her side with Tae-jin's arm across her waist and listened to the house and didn't sleep until past 2. He was awake too. She could tell from his breathing too, even too controlled. The breathing of a man managing his own wakefulness rather than surrendering to sleep. But neither of them spoke, and eventually the silence between them became something less sharp, and at some point past 2, she went under. She woke at 6 to find his side of the bed empty and still warm. Tae-jin was in the study when she found him. Not the formal one on the ground floor where he met with associates, but the smaller one on the second floor, the one with the window that looked out over the back garden and the bookshelves that held actual books rather than decorative ones, the one she'd once walked into at midnight to find him sitting on the floor with his back against the desk and his jacket off, looking at nothing. He was at the desk this time, jacket on, coffee untouched beside him, papers in front of him that he wasn't reading. He looked up when she came in. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some." She crossed to the desk and picked up his coffee cup and handed it to him. He took it without argument. "You?" "Enough." That meant no. She sat in the chair across from the desk, the one that was usually occupied by whoever he was meeting with, and looked at him. In the early morning light, with the garden gray and quiet behind him, and the untouched papers in front of him, he looked tired in a way that was different from his usual tiredness. His usual tiredness was the productive kind, the earned kind, the kind that came from days of sustained high-stakes work. This was the other kind, the kind that comes from the particular grinding work of having to reckon with people you love. "Park gave me the names last night," he said. She waited. "3 of the household staff. One of them has been here for 7 years. He set the coffee down without drinking it. Hyrin was the only one who wasn't on the list. Amara thought about Hyrin, the way she'd averted her eyes in recent months, the progressive shortening of the good mornings. She was affected by it too, she said. She wasn't driving it, but she wasn't unaffected. Tae-jin looked at her. "You noticed." "I noticed everything." A pause. "I just didn't say anything." He absorbed that. "Then, do you regret not telling me sooner?" The honest answer had more than one layer to it. "I regret that it got this far," she said. "I don't know if I could have done it differently." Every time I thought about starting that conversation, I thought about what it would cost you. And I made a decision that wasn't mine to make. What decision? That protecting your relationship with your family mattered more than protecting myself. She said it plainly, without self-pity, because she had been over it enough times in the night to arrive at the plain version. That was wrong, not noble, wrong, because you can't protect a relationship by hiding the truth of it. And I didn't trust you enough to believe you could handle it. Tae-jin was quiet for a moment. "You trusted me enough to marry me," he said. "That's different. That was the best version of you." She looked at him. "The one I didn't know yet was what you'd do when something hard actually happened. When the easy part was over. And now you know. Now I know." She met his eyes. "It's a good answer." Something shifted in his face, not a smile, not quite, but the shape of what would be a smile if they were a few weeks further from yesterday. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His jaw tightened. "My mother," he said. Amara stood. "I'll make breakfast." "You don't have to leave." "I know." She was already at the door. "But this one should be between you and her first." She heard his voice through the study door as she went down the hallway, not the words, just the tone. Low, even, the particular cadence of a man delivering information that is not open to negotiation. She did not stop to listen. Downstairs, the kitchen felt different than it had the day before. Empty, in a way that wasn't just about the absent staff. 3 of the people who had learned to work around her, to route their questions away from her and toward Misuk, were no longer employed here. Their absence left both a practical gap and something more atmospheric, the sense of a set of assumptions being physically removed from a space. Hyrin was there, standing at the counter with a cup of tea in both hands, looking out the window at the garden. She turned when Amara came in, and her expression did something complicated and quick guilt and relief, and the specific discomfort of someone who knows they occupy an ambiguous position in a situation that has recently been clarified. Mrs. Kwan, she said. She'd always used the title. But this morning the way she said it was different. More deliberate. Like she was making a decision with the syllables. "Hi, Rin," Amara said. She went to the refrigerator and started looking for eggs. "I'm going to make breakfast. Do you want something?" Pause. "I can do that. Let me sit down," Amara said. "Not unkindly, please." Hiren sat. Amara found eggs, found a pan, found the particular spot on the stove that ran slightly hotter than the others and required adjustment she'd learned. That in month 2, adding it to the private catalog of knowledge about this kitchen that she'd accumulated in all the hours she'd spent in it alone. She cracked the eggs and felt Hiren watching her and let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke into it. "I'm not angry at you," she said. Hiren's hands tightened around her cup. "You should be. Maybe." Amara adjusted the heat. "But I'm not. You were in an impossible position. Misuk has 30 years of authority in this house, and I had 8 months. The math on that isn't complicated. I still should have." Hiren stopped. "Started again. When they gave you the different plate, that first dinner. I knew. I set the table. I thought." She exhaled. "I thought I would say something if it kept happening. And then it kept happening, and I kept thinking that, and I never said anything." Amara thought about that dinner. The smaller plate. The absence of the side dishes. How she'd told herself it was an error, because the alternative required her to understand something she wasn't ready to understand. "We both waited too long," she said. Hiren looked at her. "I'm not making it equivalent," Amara said. "It's not. But I'm not spending energy on blame right now. What I want to know is whether we can work together." Hiren set her cup down on the counter. She was in her late 40s. Amara estimated a small, precise woman with hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing physical spaces with care. Her face, when it wasn't performing professional neutrality, was more readable than Amara had realized. "Yes," she said. "Straightforward. Immediate. Yes, we can." "All right," Amara said. "Then let's start there." Call Tae-jin received from his mother was not the only call he received that morning. At 7:43, while Amara was eating breakfast with Hiren, and the two of them were making a list of what needed to change in the household's day-to-day operations, Tae-jin appeared in the kitchen doorway, with his phone in his hand, and an expression that made Amara set down her fork. "I need to go out," he said. She looked at him. "What happened?" "Business." The word was not evasive. It was simply doing what it always did, which was carry about 300 pounds of context she didn't have access to in a 2-syllable container. Crossed to her, pressed his mouth to her temple in a way that was briefer than he probably meant it to be, and said quietly, "Don't go anywhere alone today. I'll have 2 of the security team with you. Tae-jin, it's not related to yesterday." He pulled back and looked at her. "It's something else. I'll explain tonight." And then he was gone. And the kitchen felt suddenly more like the kitchen it had been. In the first months, the one Amara had navigated by herself with careful competence, while the house arranged itself against her, except that now Hiren was sitting across the table. And there was a list between them, and the necklace was around Amara's neck, and the math, while not simples, had at least changed. She picked her fork back up. "All right," she said. "Where were we?" Misuk did not leave the estate that day. Amara had expected, had perhaps braced for some form of immediate departure. The dramatic exit, the gesture of wounded dignity. It was what the shape of the previous afternoon seemed to call for. Instead, Misuk remained in her rooms on the east wing, and the east wing remained quiet. And by 11 o'clock, Amara had begun to understand that she was dealing with a different kind of response than she'd anticipated. Not flight, not confrontation. Something more patient, and therefore in its way more unsettling. The first indication of what that patience contained came at noon. Amara was in the main sitting room, a room she had historically avoided because it was the room most associated with Misuk's daily occupation. the room where she received visitors and conducted the business of the household as she understood it, working through a set of supplier contracts that Park had brought her at her request. The room felt strange to sit in, like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else, except that technically they were hers now and had been all along, which somehow made it stranger. Park knocked. Mrs. Kwan. Mrs. Kwan, Mi-suk would like to speak with you. Amara looked up from the contracts now. She asked me to ask if you were available. She asked. Not summoned. Not directed asked. Amara noted this. Filed it under information. Tell her yes, she said. Mi-suk came into the room 3 minutes later. She was dressed with her usual precision, not the formal elegance of the luncheon, but the composed, careful presentation of a woman who does not appear in front of others without having considered how she appears. Her hair was immaculate. Her posture was the posture of someone who had made a decision and was delivering it from inside the decision, not from outside it. She sat in the chair across from Amara without being invited to, which was its own communication, neither defiance nor submission, but the behavior of a woman who had sat in that chair for 30 years and was not yet prepared to wait for permission to sit in her own house. Or what had been her house. The grammatical uncertainty of that was, Amara suspected, not lost on either of them. They looked at each other. I spoke with Tae-jin this morning, Mi-suk said. I know, he is not a man who changes his decisions. She said this without bitterness, just as a statement of fact about her son that she had arrived at over 35 years and had no need to embellish. I know that too, Amara said. Mi-suk looked at the contracts on the table, then at Amara's hands, then at the necklace. My mother-in-law gave me nothing, she said. Quiet, flat. When I came to this house, she gave me a room, a schedule, and a set of expectations, and she told me I had a year to prove myself worthy of carrying the Kwan name. 1 year. She paused. I spent that year disappearing into what this family needed. Amara said nothing. I am not telling you that to excuse myself, Mi-suk said. I'm telling you because you asked to be treated like you exist. I want you to understand why that request sounds the way it does to me. Because I spent 30 years not existing. Because I made myself not exist. Because I believed that was the cost of belonging here. She looked at Amara directly. When you came in, demanding to exist, without having paid what I paid, that felt like an injustice. I understand that it wasn't, but that is what it felt like. The room was very still. Amara looked at this woman, who had taken a necklace from her neck in front of 12 people, who had treated her like a domestic employee, who had suggested she leave her marriage, who had constructed 8 months of expert, deliberate exclusion, and she felt something unexpected move through her. Not forgiveness. It was too early for forgiveness, and she was not a woman who confused understanding with absolution. But something. Recognition, maybe. The specific and uncomfortable recognition of seeing a logic in something that had hurt you without that logic, making the hurt smaller. That still wasn't mine to carry, she said. No, Mi-suk said. It wasn't. You passed something on to me that you should have put down years ago. Yes. And what you passed on to me, I'm not going to pass on. Something moved across Mi-suk's face. Fast. Contained. But there. No, she said quietly. I don't imagine you will. Seo-yeon arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She came in through the front door, which she was still entitled to do, and she went directly to the sitting room. And she stood in the doorway and looked at Amara sitting at the table in the room that had been her mother's domain for 3 decades and said nothing for a full 4 seconds. Then where's my brother? Out, Amara said. He'll be back by evening. Seo-yeon came into the room. She was not in the social presentation she maintained in front of guests or during family events. She was in the mode Amara had first glimpsed the night before, after the room had emptied out the younger, rawer version. There was something that looked like a night of bad decisions in her eyes. Not alcohol. Worse. The particular devastation of someone who has spent 16 hours in their own head with their own accountability and has not enjoyed the experience. She sat on the sofa across the room. My accounts are suspended, she said. I know. I have a dinner next week. A function. I was Seo-yeon. Amara set down her pen. I'm not the one who suspended your accounts. You're the reason. I'm the reason your brother, when I found out what was happening in his own house. What he did about it is his decision. Seo Yeon's jaw worked. Her hands, in her lap, were not still. What do you want me to say? It came out rougher than she probably intended. Not a question too tired for the rising inflection. Statement that was really an admission. That she was here. That she didn't know what the architecture of this moment was supposed to be, and that she was enough off balance to be saying so, in a way she would normally never permit. Amara looked at her. Here was the thing about Seo Yeon, that Amara had understood for months, without ever having had the occasion to do anything with the understanding. She was not a stupid woman. The cruelty she had deployed over 8 months had required intelligence, the kind that understands social dynamics precisely enough to exploit them. The kind that knows exactly which comment in front of which audience will land with the effect intended. She had known what she was doing. That made it harder to excuse. But it also meant that the path to something different didn't require her to stop being intelligent. It required her to point that intelligence somewhere else. I don't want you to say anything specific, Amara said. I want you to mean it when you do. Seo Yeon looked at her. Something in the directness of it seemed to recalibrate something. I don't know if I can. She stopped. What? I don't know if I can. Another stop. Her hands pressed flat against her thighs. I don't know how to do this differently. I don't know what this looks like when it's different. My mother and I, this is how things work here. This is what I've always watched. Someone comes in from outside, they earn their place, She shook her head. I don't actually know how to be in a family that doesn't work that way. It was the most honest thing Seo Yeon had ever said in Amara's presence. By a significant margin, Amara felt the weight of it. Neither do I, she said. Not in this family. I've been figuring it out every day since I got here. A pause. Maybe we figure out the new version together. Maybe it's ugly and uncomfortable, and we have to do it anyway. Maybe her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Tae-jin's name, she answered. Where are you? His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Tight. Controlled tight. The way he controlled things when he was managing a situation that required management rather than reaction. Home, she said. Sitting room. What's wrong? I need you to go upstairs. The words came fast, but even. Take Seo Yeon with you. Don't go near the windows. I need you to do that right now. Amara was already standing. What happened? Someone I was meeting with this morning made a decision about the wrong way to apply pressure, he said. They sent people to the estate. My security team knows. They're handling it. I just need you away from the ground floor. Can you do that right now, please? She was already moving toward Seo Yeon, who had read something in Amara's face and was on her feet, with a younger sibling's instinctive response to a sibling-in-law's emergency expression. We're moving, Amara said into the phone. Good. His voice changed by a fraction, the fraction that was only for her. I'm 20 minutes out. I know. Her hand found Seo Yeon's arm. Be careful. She hung up. Seo Yeon was looking at her with wide eyes that were performing, very poorly, an attempt at composure. What upstairs, Amara said now. I'll explain on the way. They moved into the hallway, and Amara felt the house change around them as they went the subtle, practiced redistribution of Tae-jin's security staff through the property that she had observed before in minor instances, but had never felt at this particular register of urgency. 2 men appeared at the base of the staircase as they reached it. One nodded at Amara without speaking and took a position at the foot of the stairs. The other moved toward the main entrance. She got Seo Yeon upstairs, into the interior room at the end of the east corridor that had no exterior windows, the one they used during severe weather, that she had always privately thought of as the house's exhale. The room that had been designed with protection in mind before it had been furnished with anything else. Mi-suk was already there. She was sitting in the chair by the wall with her hands folded in her lap and an expression of enforced tranquility that Amara recognized as the specific face Mi-suk deployed when she was genuinely frightened and refused to be seen being so. Seo Yeon made a sound when she saw her mother and crossed the room and sat beside her, and Mi-suk's arm came around her daughter with a swiftness that was the most unguarded physical thing Amara had seen from her. Amara stood near the door. Outside, somewhere on the property, she heard something. Not close. A sound that could have been anything, a car. Something mechanical, something she couldn't identify from inside this room with its thick walls and its deliberate interiority. She heard a voice downstairs, brief and authoritative, and then it was quiet again. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door and focused on her breathing. Seo Yan looked up at her from across the room. Her face was stripped of everything. All of it, the social management, the studied cruelty, the performance of confidence that she'd been wearing every day in this house. She looked young, not in a simple way, in the complicated way of people who are young and have already done things they can't undo. Does this happen? Seo Yan started. Sometimes, Amara said. Stopped. Tried again. How do you live with that? Knowing this is his life, Amara thought about it. The honest answer. You just keep going, she said. You don't think about all of it at once. You think about the next 20 minutes. My-suk across the room looked at her. Is that what you've been doing? My-suk said. Not accusatory. Something more complicated. In this house? Amara said. Since day one. A silence moved through the room. And then, from downstairs, footsteps on the staircase, the specific rhythm of a person who knows exactly where they're going and why, and the door opened and Tae-jin was there, coat gone, shirt collar open by 2 buttons, a cut along the left side of his jaw that was still deciding how serious it was going to be. Sewon made a sound and got up. He put a hand on her shoulder briefly, his eyes already moving past her to Amara. You're all right, he said. Yes. She crossed the room to him, reached up and touched the cut on his jaw with 2 fingers, and felt him go absolutely still at the touch, the way he went still when she was tending to something. What happened? It's handled, he said. Tae-jin. It's handled, he said again. And then, because she was looking at him, the way she looked at him, the way he had never in his life been able to simply redirect, 2 men came through the east gate. They're with my people now. Nobody on the property was hurt. She kept her fingers at his jaw. You are not no one on the property, she said. The edge of his mouth moved. Not quite what it usually was, but closer. My-suk spoke. She spoke from her chair across the room, and her voice when she spoke had something in it that none of them had heard before, not in this configuration, not with this mixture of people in this particular room. Tae-jin, ah. He looked at his mother. She held his gaze for a moment. Her hands in her lap had not moved from their folded position, but the knuckles, Amara noticed, were less white than they'd been when she and Seo Yan arrived. Sit down, Mi-suk said. Let her look at that. A pause. Tae-jin sat down. Amara went to find something to clean the cut, and when she came back, Seo Yan was sitting beside Tae-jin on the edge of the small sofa, and Mi-suk had moved her chair 3 feet closer to the center of the room, and nobody had commented on any of these movements. And the room held all 4 of them in it, with the particular quality of a space that has just contained something large, and is settling back around the people left inside it. And Amara sat beside her husband, and he leaned into her slightly, the weight of a man who has been holding himself up for. He leaned into her, just slightly. The weight of a man who has been holding himself up for too many hours, finally allowing 1 degree of surrender, and Amara pressed the cloth against the cut on his jaw and felt him exhale through his nose, slow and deliberate. The exhales of someone who has been managing something large for the last several hours and is only now allowing his body to register the cost of it. The room held them all. My-suk in her chair, 3 feet closer to the center than she'd been before, hands still folded in her lap, but the knuckles no longer white. Seo Yan on the sofa beside her brother, with her shoulder almost touching his, not speaking, doing the thing that younger siblings sometimes do in the aftermath of a scare, which is simply exist in proximity to the person they were frightened for. Tae-jin with his eyes closed, and Amara's hand at his jaw, and the late afternoon light coming gray, and even through the room's single high window. Nobody said anything for several minutes. That silence was different from every other silence the house had held that day. It didn't have edges. It didn't have the quality of people managing themselves inside it, or calculating what came next, or waiting for someone else to move first. It was simply the silence of four people in a room together, who had, each in their own way, and at enormous cost, arrived at the same hour from completely different directions. Eventually, Tae-jin opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Amara. "I need to make some calls," he said. "I know, it'll take a few hours." "I know that too." He looked at her, for one more second, the look that was only ever for her, the one that didn't need any of the vocabulary his public life required. And then he stood and straightened his collar and left the room with the measured, unhurried step that was always his step, regardless of what he was walking toward. Seo Yeon watched him go. Then she looked at the floor in front of her and sat with her hands between her knees, like she was 17 and not 26, and the house settled around them. And downstairs, the sound of Tae-jin's voice on the phone, low and authoritative, moved through the walls like something structural. Calls took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Amara knew this because she watched the clock in the kitchen while she made dinner, an actual dinner. Not a formal production, but food. Kind of dinner that gets made because people need to eat. And eating together is a way of saying something that doesn't require the vocabulary of saying it. Rice and a broth she found the ingredients for in the back of the refrigerator. A side dish she'd learned to make from a cooking video 6 months ago and had practiced twice in this kitchen, alone on afternoons when the house had been too quiet and she had needed something to do with her hands. Hyrin offered to help. Amara accepted, and they worked in the kitchen with a different arrangement between them than had ever existed there before. Not yet comfortable, not easy in the way that genuine ease takes time to develop, but honest. Present with each other in the space in a way that acknowledged what the day had been without requiring either of them to narrate it. Seo Yeon appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point around 5. She stood there for a moment, taking in the scene Amara at the stove, Hyrin at the counter, the ordinary domestic fact of dinner being made with an expression that was working through several things simultaneously. "Can I do something?" she said. Amara looked at her. "Do you know how to make anything?" A small, involuntary exhale that was almost a laugh. "No." "Then sit down and talk to me while I cook. That's useful too." Seo Kien sat at the kitchen table. She picked up a spoon that was lying on the table and turned it in her fingers, not looking at it. "I had this narrative," she said, "in my head. About you." Amara stirred the broth. "I know. You were someone who didn't belong here. Who would I don't know? Take things. Change things. Make my brother into something different from what he's supposed to be." A pause. "I built it before I even met you, if I'm being honest. From the moment he called and said he was getting married. I decided before I ever saw your face." "Yes," Amara said. Not accusatory, just confirming. "And then you came here and you weren't what I built." Celso Xian set the spoon down. "You were patient and careful, and you were learning the language, and you tried with my mother. I saw as you try. I saw it, and I used it against you. I made your effort look like weakness to everyone who was watching." Hyrin, at the counter, became very focused on what she was doing. "Why are you telling me this?" Amara said. "Because my brother told me this morning, before he left, that I owe you a real apology. Not the kind that's actually about making myself feel better about what I did." Seon's voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her something. "He said I'd know the difference." Amara turned from the stove and looked at her sister-in-law across the kitchen, 26 years old. Privileged in the way that people who grow up inside power are privileged, not always aware of the water they're swimming in until someone requires them to swim in different water. Intelligent enough to have been genuinely cruel rather than casually so, which meant the same intelligence was capable of understanding the full weight of what she'd done. Not comfortable in this moment, not performing discomfort, actually in it, with the particular physical quality of genuine accountability, the set of the shoulders, the hands that didn't know where to be. "I hear you," Amara said. Seo Yeon looked up. "I'm not telling you it's fine," Amara said. "Because it isn't. What you did, the way you made me stand outside things in my own house, the way you used that luncheon, what you said at the end, those things happened. I'm not going to pretend they didn't happen, because you're telling me you regret them." She paused. "But I hear you, and that matters. The fact that you came in here and said it without dressing it up matters." Seo Yan nodded once. Quick. The nod of someone who was not going to let themselves fall apart in a kitchen but was working significantly harder than usual not to. What happens now, she said. Between us. What does it look like? Amara turned back to the stove. Honest, she said. Slow. Probably uncomfortable for a while. She adjusted the heat under the broth. But real. If you want real, a silence. I want real, Seo Yan said. Quiet, definite. Then we'll figure it out, Amara said. Tae-jin came into the kitchen at 6:47. His shirt was newly changed. He'd gone upstairs at some point in the last half hour, and she hadn't heard him, and the cut on his jaw had dried and was smaller looking than it had seemed in the immediate aftermath. The way wounds often look less significant once the adrenaline of the surrounding circumstances has settled. He stood in the kitchen doorway and took in the room the broth, the rice, Hai-rin setting bowls on the tray to carry to the dining room. Seo Yan still at the table now with a cup of tea that Hai-rin had made for her. At some point, and something in his face went quiet in the specific way. It went quiet when he was absorbing something he hadn't expected. You made dinner, he said. Someone had to, Amara said. He came into the kitchen and stood beside her at the stove and looked into the pot. My grandmother's recipe, he said. She looked at him. What? This broth, he pointed. The way you've made it. The balance of it. My grandmother made it this exact way. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Where did you learn that? A video online, she said. He was quiet for a moment. 6 months ago, she said, on a Tuesday afternoon, when you were in a meeting and the house was very quiet. I found a channel that had old Korean recipes, and I spent about 4 hours watching it. He looked at her. I was trying to belong somewhere, she said simply. Tae-jin put his hand on the counter beside her, not touching her, just the gesture of a man, placing himself deliberately next to someone, the physical language of proximity as statement. You belonged here from the day you walked in, he said. I know that now. I should have made sure you knew it then. Yes, she said, you should have. He absorbed that. Nodded. The nod of a man who has been doing a particular kind of accounting all day and has arrived at a number he's not happy with and is deciding to be accountable for it rather than argue with the math. I made assumptions, he said. I thought I brought you here. I made it clear to everyone that you were my wife, and I assumed that would be sufficient, that the decision itself would be enforced just by the fact of it. He looked at the broth. I forgot that I'm not in every room. I forgot that authority only reaches as far as the person holding it. And the rest of the time, people do what they do. You were busy, Amara said. I'm always busy. He looked at her. That can't be the reason. She held his gaze. No. It can't. I'm going to do it differently, he said. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. But I'm going to pay attention to what's happening inside this house, the same way I pay attention to what happens in the rest of my work. And I'm going to ask you things instead of assuming. A pause. And when you tell me things, I'm going to listen the first time, instead of requiring you to have held them for 8 months before I find out. That would be good, she said. He almost smiled. I'm being serious. I know. She was almost smiling too. That's why it's good. Hai-rin came back for the bowls and found them standing close together at the stove, and she collected what she needed and left again with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has excellent instincts about which moments require her immediate exit from a room. Mai-suk came down for dinner. This was not a given. Amara had not known whether she had not sent anyone to ask, had simply set a place at the table for her, the way you set a place for someone and let the act itself be the invitation. She appeared in the dining room doorway at 7:15, in fresh clothes, with her hair as it always was and her posture as it always was, and she looked at the table at Tae-jin, at the head of it, at Seo Yan across from her own seat, at the bowl set for her, at Amara sitting beside her husband, and she came in and sat down without comment. The first few minutes were quiet, not the charged silence of the afternoon. Something more like the silence of people who are very tired and have something in front of them that is warm and was made by someone who could have made nothing and chose not to. Tae-jin served his mother's bowl first. He did it the way he did things without announcing it, without the gesture being larger than the gesture needed to be. He simply served her bowl and set it in front of her, and she looked at it and then looked at him with an expression that held 35 years in it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Then he served Amara. Then Seo Yan. Then himself. They ate. Somewhere around the third or fourth minute, Mi-suk looked up at Amara. "This broth," she said. "Yes?" A pause. Mi-suk's face was doing something careful. "My mother-in-law made it this way," she said. "I know," Amara said. "Tae-jin told me just now." Mi-suk looked at her son. Something passed between them, the specific look of a son and mother who know each other's faces well enough to have entire conversations in a glance. And what moved between them in this one was complicated and decades deep and not available to anyone else in the room. She was not, Mi-suk said, looking back at the bowl, an easy woman. "No," Amara said. "No." She took another spoonful. She believed that difficulty was the price of anything worth having. She was not wrong exactly, but she applied it to everything, including people. A pause. Including me. Seo Yan was very still on her side of the table. "She made me earn this house the way a contractor earns a building," Mi-suk continued. "Every room, every role, every occasion. She watched me perform until she was satisfied, and then she raised the bar, and I performed again. She set her spoon down. I told myself I was becoming stronger, that the difficulty was making me ready for something." She looked at Amara. "Pass the difficulty on to you. I called it tradition. I called it necessity." She paused. "I think I was passing on what I didn't know how to put down." The table was very quiet. "I understand that," Amara said. "Doesn't make it acceptable." "No," Mi-suk said. "It doesn't. And I understand. It doesn't mean you're asking me to forgive you tonight." Mi-suk looked at her steadily. "No, I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm telling you a true thing. What you do with it is your own business." Amara looked at this woman, the architecture of her, the 30 years of discipline built over whatever the original woman had been, before the Kwan house had processed her into this shape, and she thought about Dorothy at the gate, and she thought about the Korean lessons, and she thought about the spoon, the smaller plate, the necklace, the hallway, the 48 months of days she had spent in this house, telling herself she could be patient enough for two people. "All right," she said. "I hear you." Mi-suk picked up her spoon again. They finished dinner. The next 3 weeks were not clean. That needs to be said plainly. Because the temptation when telling a story is to let the moment of reckoning stand in for the process that follows it, to let the dinner table scene be the period at the end of the sentence rather than what it actually was, which was a comma or possibly a semicolon in the middle of something much longer and less cinematically satisfying. The 3 employees who were let go left the estate within 48 hours. Their departure left practical gaps that required filling, and the process of filling them, interviewing, selecting, establishing the new chain of authority explicitly so that there was no ambiguity about who the household answered to, fell primarily to Amara, working with Hai-rin and Park, and it was unglamorous work. It involved spreadsheets and scheduling, and 2 conversations with candidates that went nowhere, and one that did, and a morning when the heating system in the East Wing developed a problem that required a technician who didn't show up until 4 hours after his scheduled time, and Amara managed all of this while also continuing her Korean lessons every morning and calling her mother every Sunday and learning, day by day, the actual weight of running a household that had been running according to someone else's gravity for 30 years. Tae-jin did what he said he would do. He paid attention. He asked. When she told him things, he listened the first time. He was not perfect at this. There were days when his work consumed him so completely that she'd mention something at dinner and have to say it again 3 days later when he'd had the processing space to actually receive it. And those days were frustrating in the ordinary way that any 2 people's ordinary failures are frustrating. But the difference between the first 8 months and the next 8 was simple and enormous. He was trying. Not performing trying, actually reconfiguring the way he moved through his own home to account for the person he'd brought into it. That was something. Choi Dong-wook, the security chief, had his conversation with Tae-jin the morning after the incident. Amara was not in the room and didn't ask what was said. What she observed was that Choi remained employed a decision that surprised her slightly, until Tae-jin explained one evening that Choi had made a mistaken judgment, rather than a betrayal of loyalty, and that those two things required different responses. He thought he was keeping the household peace, Tae-jin said. He thought it wasn't his business. He was wrong, but wrong about the category of a problem is different from working against us. Amara had thought about that, and you trust that distinction. I've known Choi for 11 years, he said. I know the difference in him between those two things. A pause. And I told him that if it happens again, if anything happens to you in this house that he knows about and doesn't tell me, there won't be a conversation. He understood. She believed it. That was the thing about Tae-jin's authority, it wasn't performed, which meant it didn't require elaborate enforcement to be real. It simply was, the way certain facts simply are, and the people around it adjusted to the fact rather than requiring it to prove itself continuously. Seo-yeon moved out of the estate 2 weeks after the luncheon, not because she was forced to. Tae-jin had made clear that the suspension of her accounts was about consequence rather than exile, and that the door of the estate was open to her on the terms he'd described, respect for Amara, conducted in behavior rather than word. The move was her own decision, made for her own reasons that she explained to Tae-jin in a conversation Amara wasn't part of, and that Tae-jin summarized afterward as she needs to find out who she is without the house telling her. She found an apartment in a part of Seoul she'd always thought of as beneath her, and got a job at a gallery, working in communications, a position she was, as it turned out, genuinely good at, because the same intelligence that had been deployed in constructing elaborate social glotions was extremely effective when pointed at the work of making people feel included in something. The irony of this was not lost on anyone. She came to the estate on the third Sunday of the month for dinner. The first few of these dinners were careful, structured in the way of things that are still figuring out what they are. But by the second month, there was something different. The way Seo-yeon moved through the house, a new quality of ease that had nothing to do with entitlement and everything to do with not needing the house to be a stage anymore. She brought Amara a book from the gallery on the third visit, a collection of photography, Korean and American both, without comment, just set it on the table in the hall as she came in. Amara read it cover to cover. She told Seo-yeon so the next Sunday. Seo-yeon looked at her for a moment, then nodded, not effusive, not performing gratitude for being acknowledged, just receiving it and giving something back. That was growth, in the specific form it takes in people who have never needed it before. Unglamorous, small, real. Suk moved into the smaller house on the estate's north property, a separate residence that had been used for guests and storage and occasional family visits, that was given a proper renovation over the course of 3 weeks, in which Mi-suk's opinions about the renovation were solicited exactly as often as she asked to give them, which was several times, and were incorporated where they made practical sense, and noted and set aside where they didn't. This arrangement was not at first peaceful. Mi-suk had lived in the main estate for 30 years. She had managed its staff, organized its social calendar, run its kitchen protocols and maintenance and schedules and seasonal preparations with an expertise built from 3 decades of daily practice. Removing herself to the smaller house was not a demotion she experienced quietly or absorbed without protest, and there were weeks in those first months where the protest was communicated through the particular method of sustained, controlled dissatisfaction, a tone of voice here, an observation about the way something was being done there, a comment made to Seo-yeon during a Sunday dinner that was clearly directed at Amara without being addressed to Amara. Amara noticed all of it. She developed, during this period, a practice of response that was different from either of her previous modes, not the long-swallowed patience of the first 8 months, not the confrontational clarity of the luncheon afternoon, but something third. A specific kind of direct, unreactive engagement that took what Mi-suk said seriously as a statement without treating it as an attack requiring defense. When Mi-suk observed that the East Garden was being managed differently than she would have managed it, Amara asked what Mi-suk's method had been and why. Not to adopt it necessarily, to understand it. Sometimes the understanding was enough for both of them. Sometimes it wasn't. But the conversation was always the same, direct, specific, without either of them, pretending the history between them wasn't there, and without either of them making the history the only thing the conversation was about. It was slow. It was uncomfortable. It was real. The moment Amara recognized that something had genuinely changed came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 4 months after the luncheon. She was in the garden, the East Garden, that Mi-suk had commented on, which had been re-landscaped according to a plan Amara had developed with the gardener over 3 months, incorporating some of Mi-suk's methods and some of her own preferences, and resulting in something that belonged to neither of them entirely, and therefore to both. She was sitting on the low stone bench, with her Korean textbook open in front of her, the one she'd moved on to after finishing the beginner's series she'd been working through since before she left Chicago. And she heard footsteps on the garden path and looked up. Mi-suk was standing a few feet away, with a cup of tea in each hand. Amara looked at the 2 cups. Mi-suk held one out. Amara took it. Suk sat on the other end of the bench, not close, a deliberate distance that was its own communication, and looked at the garden for a moment without saying anything. Then your accent has improved. Amara looked at her. My Korean? Yes. Mi-suk sipped her tea. I've noticed over the last few months. The vowels are cleaner. I've been working on it, Amara said. I know. Mi-suk looked at the garden. I can hear that you've been working on it. They sat. The silence between them on that bench was nothing like the silences of the first 8 months. It didn't have a current of hostility running underneath it. It didn't have the quality of a held breath. It was simply 2 women sitting in a garden with tea in the specific, unelaborated way that sometimes happens between people who have been through something large together and come out the other side into the ordinary air. Your gardener, Mi-suk said eventually, nodding toward the re-landscape section, has good hands. He does, Amara said. The arrangement along the north wall is better than what I had. This was coming from Kwon Mi-suk, approximately equivalent to anyone else, composing a lengthy formal apology and having it notarized. Amara received it accordingly. Thank you, she said simply. The dinner that mattered most happened on a Saturday, in late autumn, 5 months after the luncheon. It wasn't planned to be significant. It was simply the monthly family dinner, Seo-yeon coming from her apartment, Mi-suk from the North House, Tae-jin home by 7 after a week in Japan that had left him with the particular compressed tiredness of international travel layered on top of organizational demands. Hyrin and the 2 new staff members had prepared the table and the food and withdrawn in the way of people who have learned how this household operates and are comfortable operating within it. Amara was the last to come downstairs. She hadn't planned that either. She'd been on the phone with Dorothy, who had called to talk about a Nijiber situation and ended up talking for 40 minutes about her own memories of being a young woman in a new city, a conversation Amara hadn't initiated but hadn't ended. Because Dorothy didn't often talk about that period of her life, and the things she was saying were worth hearing. When she finally came down, she walked into the dining room and found Tae-jin at the head of the table, Seo-yeon across from what would be Amara's chair, Mi-suk beside her daughter, and Mi-suk was laughing. Not performing graciousness. Actually laughing at something Seo-yeon had apparently just said, with the specific unguarded quality of a woman caught by something genuinely funny in a moment when she hadn't been preparing to be caught. She recovered when Amara came in, not out of the old hostility, but out of the same composure flex she applied to everything. The habit of presentation that was simply too old to shed entirely. But the laughter had been real. Amara sat down. Tae-jin reached for her hand under the table. Not dramatically. Not for anyone to see. Just the reach of a man locating the person he wanted to be next to. She gave him her hand. Seon said something to Mi-suk about the gallery, a situation with a vendor that apparently involved a misunderstanding about shipping costs that had escalated in a way Seo-yeon clearly found both absurd and professionally educational. And as she described it, Mito asked questions, specific, interested questions about the business mechanics of it, in the tone of someone who is genuinely curious, rather than performing interest. Amara watched this. She thought about the woman in the hall upstairs, the night of the luncheon, Seo-yeon's arm around Mi-suk coming down automatically. Mi-suk's face frightened, in the way she never allowed her face to be frightened. She thought about what it meant that those two women had built a world in this house that had required her exclusion to sustain itself, and what it cost them when that world required changing, and what it had required of her to sit in it and not collapse and not retaliate and not let it make her into someone smaller than she'd arrived as. She thought about Dorothy saying, "On the phone 20 minutes ago, you sound different." And Amara had said, "Different how?" And Dorothy had thought about it for a moment and said, "Settled." Like someone who knows where the furniture is. She had meant it as a small thing. But sitting at this table with Tae-jin's hand in hers, and Seo-yeon making her mother laugh, and the food on the table and the particular quality of the autumn light through the dining room windows, it was not small. The furniture was where she knew it, because she had put it there. Not perfectly, not without cost. Not in the clean narrative arc that stories sometimes suggest is available to people who simply want the right things with enough conviction. But hers. Later that evening, after Seo-yeon had left, and Mi-suk had walked the path back to the north house in her good coat with her hands in her pockets, Amara and Tae-jin sat in the small second-floor study, the one with the window over the garden and the real books, with the lamp on and the remains of tea between them. She was reading. He was working through something on his phone that occasionally required a response and occasionally didn't. And the room held them both with the particular ease of two people who have been in enough difficult rooms together that a quiet room registers as the gift it actually is. After a while, Tae-jin set his phone down. Amara looked up. "My mother smiled at you tonight," he said. "I know. When you came in, I saw. She doesn't do that," he said. "She's never in my memory. She has never smiled at anyone coming into a room who she wasn't performing warmth for. Tonight wasn't performance." Amara put her book down. "No, I don't think it was." "What did you do?" he said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. The question of a man who knows how impenetrable his mother is and has watched something penetrate. Amara thought about the garden bench, the 2 cups of tea, comment about vowels, and the comment about the north wall, and the 4 months of slow, uncomfortable, unglamorous real engagement that had preceded them. "I didn't perform either," she said. He looked at her. "She spent 30 years in a system that required her to perform," Amara said. "So she learned to look for performance in everyone else, because that's what she knew. And when she looked for it in me, I didn't give it to her. Not in the first 8 months, that was fear, not authenticity, but after. When I stopped being afraid and started just being who I actually am in this house." She started seeing something she recognized, a pause. Not herself, but someone who wasn't performing, someone who was actually there. Tae-jin was quiet for a moment. "She told me something last week," he said. "When I called her." Amara waited. "She said she thought she had been afraid of what you were going to do to this family." He paused. "And she said she had been wrong about what that meant. She thought it meant you were going to take something, change something, break the way things work." He looked at her. "She said what you actually did was stay. She didn't expect you to stay." Amara considered this. "I stayed because I didn't have anything to prove by leaving," she said. "Leaving would have been easier, in a lot of ways. Stayed because this is my home, because this is my husband. Because I wanted this, not the version of it I was given in the first 8 months, but the actual thing." She looked at Tae-jin. "Stayed because some things are worth the cost, and some things aren't, and I knew the difference." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles, not the careful, deliberate gesture of a man making a point, but simply what his hand did when it was holding hers and he wasn't thinking about it. "I want to call your mother," he said. She looked at him. "Dorothy, I want to call her and tell her." He stopped. "Try it again." "I want to call her and tell her that her daughter is..." Another stop. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. more the sound of a man who handles language precisely in his professional life and keeps running into the limits of precision when it comes to the people he loves. She already knows, Amara said. I want her to hear it from me. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had carried a necklace for 3 years, who had learned her mother's printer model, who had come home from Busan and stood in his own entrance hall and listened and not flinched and done what needed doing without requiring a script for any of it. She'd like that, Amara said. He nodded.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, she agreed. The necklace was around her neck. She'd stopped noticing it in the daily, stopped tracking its presence the way she'd tracked it in the early weeks, when wearing it had felt like a statement she was making continuously. It had become simply part of how she wore herself. Something settled into the ordinary rotation of her days, like knowing where the furniture was, like the vowels that had been getting cleaner without her noticing until someone pointed it out. But she noticed it now, sitting in the lamplight with Tae-jin's hand around hers, in the room, the real books and the window over the garden that was bare and gray in the autumn dark outside. She lifted her free hand and touched the pendant for a moment, the warm gold of it, old in the way that meant something had been carried a long time, worn in the way that meant it had been against a body every day for decades before it was hers. Tae-jin's grandmother had worn it, had given it to him when he was 22, had said, "You'll know when to give it." He'd known. That had been the foundation of all of it, not the Kwan name, not the estate, not the organization, or the power, or the 30 years of architecture his family had built into the walls of this house. Just a man who had known, and had been right, and had been willing to stand behind, the knowing when it required standing behind. The rest had been her. Not only her, she wasn't interested in stories that made one person entirely responsible for their own salvation, that turned survival into a solitary achievement and left out the particular weight of systems and the particular cost of being made to prove something no one else in the room had to prove. That wasn't the truth of it, and she wasn't going to make it the story of it. But she had done the work. She had held herself together in rooms that were built to take her apart. She had learned the language and brought the gift, and set the table, and cooked the broth, and sat on the bench, and taken the tea, and looked her mother-in-law in the eye, and refused every single time. From the moment she'd stood at the bottom of that staircase, in her carefully chosen dress, refused to be smaller than the person she'd arrived as. That was hers. Nobody gave it to her, and nobody could take it. In the North House, Mi-suk sat at the writing desk in her room and looked at the letter she'd been trying to write for 3 weeks. It was addressed to Amara. She had started it 6 times. The first 4 attempts had been too formal, the language of a woman managing the situation rather than speaking inside it. The 5th had gone too far the other direction, into a kind of sentiment that she didn't trust in herself, that felt more like performance than the honest thing. The 6th was closer, but still wrong in some way she couldn't identify. She looked at the current page for a long time. Then she picked up the pen and wrote, "I was afraid of you before I met you, and I did not know it. I want you to know that what I'm learning about what fear makes people do, and what it costs them when they do it, is coming from watching you. That is not a comfortable thing to admit. I'm admitting it anyway." She set the pen down, read it back, left it. In the gallery apartment across the city, Seo Yan was at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her phone beside her, and the view of the street outside the window that she'd initially considered depressing and had come to find she preferred to what she'd had before, not because it was better in any objective sense, but because it was hers in a way that nothing in the estate had been hers, and hers in the particular way of things you've earned rather than inherited. She was looking at the photography book she'd given Amara, a second copy she'd bought for herself. She turned to the photograph, in the middle of it, the one that had made her buy it. In the first place, the one she'd been looking at the night she'd decided to bring it to Amara. A woman walking alone through a crowd, in motion, in focus, while everything around her was blurred. Not standing still, not performing stillness, moving and present, and entirely herself, in the middle of all that blur. She'd looked at that photograph and thought of Amara in the dining room, at the luncheon, sitting down, in the chair at the table, like she belonged there. She hadn't wanted to think it at the time, had stored it somewhere and covered it with the ordinary motions of the days that followed. But it had been there, underneath everything. From that moment on, the acknowledgement she hadn't been ready to make in the luncheon afternoon, but couldn't, after a certain point, keep from making. The woman in the photograph was moving through something that was trying to stop her and wasn't stopping. That was someone. That was actually someone. Downstairs in the Kwan estate, Tae-jin turned off his phone. He looked at Amara. She looked back at him. The lamp between them made the room warm in the way that rooms in autumn are warm when there's light in them against the dark outside, and the garden beyond the window was quiet and cold and bare, and the house around them held the particular settled silence of a place that has been through something and is resting. "Come to bed," she said. He stood. She turned off the lamp. They went upstairs through a house that was hers, not because she'd been given it, and not because she'd taken it, and not because anyone had decided to grant her a position she'd been auditioned for. She walked through it because it was the home she'd built out of the materials of an imperfect year, with the husband she'd chosen and the family that was still figuring out how to be a family. With her Chicago bones and her morning Korean lessons and her grandmother's broth recipe learned from a video on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, with the necklace she'd earned not by performing, but by persisting, with everything she'd refused to put down even when the house was arranged against her. She walked through it the way a woman walks through her own home in the dark, without hesitation, because she knew exactly where the furniture was.